For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Sashni Midley. Oscar van Heerden joins me today to discuss his book, Consistent or Confused. In this book, you look at the politics of former President Thabo Mbeki's foreign policy between 1995 and 2007. In your assessment, do you think that Mbeki was able to drive a coherent foreign policy for South Africa and Africa more broadly?
I do think he has managed to do that. I mean, his administration, as you know, we're really focused on two key aspects. The one domestically was to look at some of the economic challenges that is faced by the poorest of the poor. And then, of course, internationally it was to ensure that we drive an Africa agenda and really put Africa first in terms of global agendas. And through his introduction of African Renaissance, I think that he has managed to put that quite highly on the agenda. And of course, subsequently the formation of NEPAD, formation of the African Union that came out of the OAU. So I think in the main, broadly, his foreign policy objectives were met.
You look at three key ideas when examining South Africa's external relations. What are these three key ideas, and please explain their relevance?
Yeah, the three case studies I look at is really, the one is in the realm of international relations, which usually is more obsessed with security matters. There are other softer issues that plays a part in international relations, and here we're talking of trade agreements, how those trade agreements come about, how you manage to play the game and the politics and the to and fro, the negotiations and so on, to optimize the return for you as a country. So I concentrate on an economic case study, which is our trade agreement with the European Union. And really I'm looking at two aspects there. The one was how you negotiate between a small economy, literally a small economy like South Africa, in comparison to a giant like the European Union. And can one really optimize one's returns in such a skewed negotiations, settlement? And then the second element is, in doing so, did South Africa consider its agreements with its immediate neighbors, Lesotho, Swaziland, Botswana, Namibia, and Zimbabwe? And I come to the conclusion that it's a very difficult, finely balanced act to try and satisfy your domestic, regional requirements and obligations and that of your self-national interests with the European Union. So there's that. And then the second element deals really with regional tension. If there's a regional problem, or if there's a challenge within your region, in this case Southern Africa, in the example of Zimbabwe and the crisis of Zimbabwe, I then look at how a particular hegemon, such as South Africa, play an important role to try and manage that crisis. And then the last one is on security, in which I look at the United Nations Security Council and our tenure as South Africa, our 2-year tenure on that council. So those were just broadly the three aspects. I thought give it a bit of a variety and not just the security focus.
What were the key objectives under South Africa's foreign policy under Mbeki, and were these objectives achieved?
It's not so much under Mbeki per se. I think, when the South African government had to decide on the overall objectives of foreign policy under Mandela's stewardship, already there was a big emphasis placed on human rights being the cornerstone of our foreign policy, and the fact that we want to ensure that human rights are going to be exported all over the world. So that was one of the key fundamentals. Then the second one was Africa first. I know this is now the buzzword with Trump, President Trump talking about America first, but really it was the South Africans that put an objective that said in our foreign policy we want Africa to be put high on the agenda. Challenges that are faced by Africa needs to find expression within global fora and on the agenda of these international institutions. And then lastly was a question of peace and security in Africa, first and foremost. A more globally equitable world in terms of the unequal divide between the wealthy and the haves and the have-nots. And so, in a way, even though South Africa is a fairly small player internationally, it set out an objective that said that we will always try and fight for a more equitable and fairer world order. And so those are the three main objectives of the South African foreign policy.
Some academics have concluded that South Africa's foreign policy in the post-apartheid period is confused. Do you agree with this?
No, I don't. I mean, that's the whole purpose of the book, and the controversial title of Consistent or Confused. I don't think that the South African foreign policy post-94 was confused. I think that there was a very clear understanding of what the objectives were, trying to attain them. And that was really about saying, as South Africa coming out of this pariah state environment, we want to make sure that never again will there a system such as apartheid find expression anywhere in the world, whether on the continent or further afield, but also saying that we want to ensure that those powers that are indeed the major powers in the world need to have a more equitable approach to development, to upliftment, and so forth. And so I think that, if anything, it was an ambitious foreign policy and with its objectives. But I do think that, if not ambitious, then what? I think that the South Africans certainly have managed to inculcate a sense of, and of course have demonstrated in more than one way, that indeed they are leading by example. And so people talk of the miracle that took place in South Africa post-1994, where we opted for more reconciliation with our white counterparts in the country, and it didn't lead to massive bloodshed and so forth. And that is saying to the world that we've got something here that we would like to export, that we think people can learn from. Then, of course, we also gave up the nuclear weapons, which gave us a particular ethical and moral standing within the non-proliferation environment, in which we can stand tall and demand that others should not proliferate these weapons of mass destruction, because we had it and we voluntarily gave it up. And so I think that it was an ambitious foreign policy and ambitious objectives post-1994, but it's been good so far. I don't think it has been confused.
Democratic South Africa has long championed UN reform. What are the most important reforms of the UN system that South Africa has sought? Has any progress been made, and what are the obstacles to reform?
You see, this is an interesting one, because, the two main things that comes out in the book is firstly the UN Security Council and the reform that is required there, to the extent that its current makeup, with its permanent 5 members who's got veto powers, is really a direct result of World War II and the World War II order. The world has moved on. It has become a multipolar world. And so that makeup is not reflected within the UN Security Council as we speak. Some will argue that, for example, the United Kingdom and France are no longer the superpowers that they were 40, 50 years ago. Germany certainly would argue that they need a seat at the table. And similarly, India and Brazil. And so South Africa, being part of the BRICS alliance, also throws its lot in being one of the dominant economies and countries within the African continent. No doubt there's competition in terms of Nigeria and Egypt, but that's a healthy competition, and we'll get there when we cross that bridge. But the point I'm making is that there's a definite emphasis that the UN Security Council needs to transform and be reflective of a more current global order. So that was the first thing. The second thing was around the Human Rights Commission. When South Africa came into the UN system post-94, this was one of the first things they put a heavy emphasis on, because they were of the opinion, and it's still very much a debatable issue out there in the realm of international relations, but they were of the opinion that the UN Security Council overstepped on many occasions its jurisdiction. And the UN Charter is very clear that really the matters that concerns the UN Security Council are those matters that pose an international security threat to the world. And so when you have a a situation like North Korea, for example, who is constantly firing missiles into the Pacific, threatening Japan and South Korea, and so on, it has the potential to disrupt and become an international security matter. And so that should be something that the UN Security Council focus on. However, when it comes to an issue such as, for example, whether we condone or condemn rape as a weapon of war, because you have troops that go into certain countries and then women get raped and so on, that is not a matter that belongs on the table of the UN Security Council. It's a matter that should really find expression at the Human Rights Commission, the UN Human Rights Commission. However, in the past, those were all the sorts of issues that came to the UN Security Council. And so South Africa came in and said, look, you're overstepping your jurisdiction. These are matters that belong elsewhere. And so it doesn't belong on this table. And so that caused certain tension, of course. But that was in the main and of course the powers of the General Assembly as a third issue. You know, it's not just a rubber stamp. We are not just here to agree as world leaders. What is the actual power that you give the General Assembly vis-a-vis the UN Security Council? Or are they just there to look nice and sit and so on? So really that was the thrust of the South Africans' approach to UN reform. And yeah, it's an ongoing battle.
Tell us how trade agreements highlight the economic aspects of South Africa's foreign policy. How do South Africa's international trade agreements impact on SADC and the Southern African Customs Union?
Okay, let me start with the first element. Firstly, trade agreements is an important part of foreign policy. Foreign policy is a policy that ensures that you conduct yourself in a particular way, in terms of security, in terms of economic relations and so forth. And trade between countries in a globalized world has become such a big phenomena. I want some of your coffee, you want some of my bananas, I want some of your tomatoes, and so on and so forth. And so it is how we trade with each other. And our embassies and our consulates are everywhere all over the world are empowered and mandated to try and ensure that we look into our economic interests, so that we can grow the economy, create jobs, narrow the inequality gap. So the link between the domestic policies and the foreign policy is very much closely connected. If you have successful trade agreements, such as the TDCA with the European Union, such as the AGOA agreement with the United States, and of course our bilateral agreements with some of the BRICS countries, including China, that brings foreign direct investment, manufacturing base, etc. That's all things that then contributes to a more stable environment, a job creating environment domestically. And so that link is very, very important. We do have standing agreements with our regional partners, SADC as well as SACU in the Customs Union. And of course, because South Africa has such a huge economy, whatever it negotiates with China or the US will invariably have an impact on some of our smaller trading partners in the region. The balancing act comes in as to ensuring that it doesn't overtly negatively impact on a country like Lesotho, Swaziland or Namibia. So you need to really try and that's why, for example, even though we negotiated the trade development and cooperation agreement with the European Union between them and us, we were also, as South Africa, very involved in the economic, in the EPAs that was negotiated between the EU and some of our neighbors specifically. South Africa's role was very much part of that, to ensure that, one, we don't cross our lines, but also we don't disadvantage each other. And I think I think that chapter is going to be an interesting chapter for people to read and just see how, because what I try to bring out there is the difficulty between making sure that you serve your national interests and your domestic priorities vis-a-vis those of the Namibians or the Botswana people, if I put it crudely. And I think that it's not as easy as one thinks in terms of the balancing act. So I think that's sort of where trade agreements play its part within the foreign policy sphere.
What is your assessment of South Africa's role and impact during Zimbabwe's humanitarian crisis of the early 2000s?
Yeah, so that's the third chapter, which I think most people are going to buy the book to in order to read that chapter on the Zimbabwe issue. I think first and foremost, people need to understand that South Africa had, broadly speaking, two clear objectives. One was to ensure peace and stability within a neighboring country. No country wants there to be instability and violence just on its doorstep. So the first priority was to actually make sure that there's peace and stability, and that's easier said than done. You know, so when SADC decided to appoint President Mbeki as the chief mediator in that crisis, that was the first thing that needed to happen. The second thing was that the Zimbabwean problem must be resolved by Zimbabweans. And I think it's an important point. It's an important point because when you read that chapter, one of the things that Mbeki told me about when I interviewed him was the pressure that was placed on him by the United States and by the United Kingdom to try and have regime change in Zimbabwe at the time. And how he had to resist that. Because at the time, the assessment was that it would not be in the interest, not of Zimbabwe, nor of the region, and certainly not for South Africa. And so that tension was there to say, how do we manage this crisis, mediate through and accommodate all the stakeholders without actually coming with a military option, where you put boots on the ground and you effectively do what they did in Iraq at the same time, what they did in Libya at the same time, and so on. And I need not tell you, Shashni, where those countries are now because of those regime change options. And so our responsibility was to ensure that we bring peace and stability, which ultimately, as Mbeki was exiting his administration here domestically, resulted in a global political agreement in Zimbabwe. Now, of course, as is the case with most of these things in the international relations sphere, there are those that support the GPA, and there are those that says it's not worth the paper it's written on. What we do know is that we had managed to make sure that there is some level of stability, that there is not overt violence, and that was really the most important objective for us. Of course, economically, Zimbabwe remains in dire straits. Hence, we have a huge refugee and immigrant community of Zimbabwe here within our borders, and that is an ongoing matter. And I think, even though people think it is absconding responsibility, the South Africans and the South African government is saying that there's very little we can do about the current situation. Zimbabweans must take matters into their own hands if they want to effect real change within the Zimbabwean situation.
Do you think South Africa enhanced its standing in the international community between 1995 and 2007? What is your assessment of SA foreign policy in the post-Mbeki period?
Okay, so I think we have improved our standing. And you would recall that South Africa, under the stewardship of President Mbeki, was invited to a number of multilateral fora, the G20, the G77. He was asked to facilitate and participate in various panels of the United Nations and so on. And also the fact that we've established our embassies in more than 130 countries in the world, just reintegrating into the international community. So I think from that perspective, we have improved our standing. Again, I should mention our standing were also greatly improved by the way we managed the transition into a democratic South Africa, a world-class constitution and a Bill of Rights that is held all over the world, and the voluntary giving up of weapons of mass destruction, and quite honestly, over the last 20 odd years, a fairly stable growing of democracy as we know it. You know, regular general elections that is fairly free and fair, not with violence, local government elections that are fairly free and fair, respect for the Constitutional Court and for the Constitution, as well as all the other liberties that usually is associated with a world-class democracy, such as freedom of the press, freedom of expression, freedom to protests, and so on and so forth. So I do think we've enhanced our standing. I mean, this last week's phone call from the Trump administration is a further indication that even a country such as South Africa, on the tip of Africa, cannot be ignored in terms of the role it plays and the contribution it can make and is indeed making, both in terms of peacekeeping on the continent, peace building on the continent, but also further afield in terms of trade, our natural resources and so forth. So yeah, we are taken serious, and we have enhanced our position, availing the first female commissioner for the African Union, and the role and contribution we make there financially and otherwise. So I think we've done well since 1995. In terms of the post-Mbeki era, there was a few missteps right at the beginning under the Zuma administration. You'd recall we voted at the UN in favor of Resolution 1973, which meant that we endorsed the no-fly zone in Libya, and that ended up in a complete disaster. Muammar Gaddafi was assassinated. Not our finest hour. But since then, we've made sure that we keep the institutional memory, that we start becoming more consistent again. And I think that South Africa has been consistent, even on the al-Bashir case, contrary to popular opinion. There, I'm saying the South Africans are consistent because this drive that has been there to reform multilateral institutions such as the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, the IMF, and indeed the ICC, because it too, people argue, are skewed, are subjected to the authority of the United Nations Security Council when some of those permanent members are not signatories to the Rome Statute and so on. These are some of the contradictions that the South African government brings to the fore when arguing as to why should they remain part of the ICC and that debacle around President Omar Bashir. But I think, yeah, I think fairly consistent till now.
That was Oscar van Heerden discussing his book, Consistent or Confused.